This is the pipeline for Krimson's 3D to 2D pipeline. So after you make your model and you've textured it in Substance Painter, make sure you have your attribute editor open and your hypershade. Click on your object, apply the material, and OK. So if you click on your material here and you click this button, it'll open up the grid. I usually like to work with it, so it's a fast way to go back and forth here. And it's also nice to see where everything's located, and you don't have to backtrack as much as often. Instead of having to go here and then go back to color or roughness, you can just click on bump 2D or the image here, and it takes you to the same options. So by default, we'll be using the color, metalness, and roughness sliders, as well as bump mapping for anything that's using it. Metalness, also, you can leave blank if your object shows no metalness at all, so dielectric. Anything that shouldn't have any metal, you shouldn't have to plug in a metalness node if you don't want to. But whatever I do for roughness will apply the same to metalness. So you apply your color. The settings for colors should be fine by default. Make sure your Colorspace is sRGB. Next, we go back to our platform. Our roughness, or our metal, as I said, will be the same as our roughness. You go to your roughness, make sure your Colorspace, instead of being sRGB, make sure it's set to raw, and make sure under color balance, alpha's luminance is turned on. Also, sometimes when you apply a texture image, this resets back to sRGB. So apply the image first and then change the color space. And remember, this is for both this is both for metalness and roughness. For your geometry, we want to make sure you're bump mapping. When you first click here and choose file, you'll be applying a file, right? But you'll notice it made this bump 2D node inside of the hypershade. Which, by the way, we have this open because we click here and then here, and this opens up all the node connections. So this is connected to our camera normal. This is our image, and this is the bump settings. When you click on this, by default, it'll be set to bump. You'll want to change this to tangent space normals, and you want to make sure your image for your normal map is set to this. Make sure it's set to the value, not to the depth. Also, just for the normals, you have to make sure you have the attribute editor open and you turn off flip R and G channels. Otherwise, the direction of your normals will be flipped, and sometimes things might appear darker or indented rather than going out. Once you have your material ready, just go back to your scene, go to File, Import. Open up the scene, usually called level and then lighting render underneath. Import it. And this will bring the camera as long as with the HDRI. And this cone should be pointing to the general direction where you'll be rendering. You can delete that if you want. Now we have two cameras in here. We have camera shape. And usually, if you look at the outliner, the ones that are part of the render scene have the name of the scene in front. We'll be using this Cyberpunk lighting render. So you just go to Arnold, open Arnold render view, right? Now, this is a small platform. We want to make sure we keep our resolution correct. If you go up here, it opens up your render settings. So we are rendering in PNG. You scroll down, make sure you have your renderable camera to be the right one. And then we're going to switch this from the default. We're going to be making our own width and height in pixels. So a small platform that takes about maybe 1/8 of your screen, 1/4 of your screen, should be about 256 wide. And 128, if there's a lot of transparency space, you can try applying that. This will make it look more like a rectangle rather than a square, but we will be using less memory because we'll be making better use of the texture space. So 256 by 128 is the one I placed for these. Then you can just test your render out. This won't render correctly because I have it set to be, well, it did, but you can try this one. And if you really want to, you can try your own camera. This is the camera shape 1. This is the render cam. This one was set to work for this one. It's all the way back here because I had a bigger bridge asset. You can move it closer if you need to. This one, they aren't locked, right? Additionally, if you would like to make them orthographic so the perspective doesn't look bizarre, you can just click on your camera, scroll down, Arnold, change your front camera type from perspective to orthographic. Now, there's some other cool options in here like VR camera, but we'll be using, obviously for a game, orthographic. And yeah, as that should look correct. I've made it so these background does not show up in your render because by default HDRIs will show up in the background for your renders. So you want to make sure you click on it and then Skydome, display, hide on playback. Where did I place that? Drawing overrides, nope. One second. Well, one of the settings in the attribute editor allows you to make it so it doesn't show up in your renders. The reason we want this is so we have this black to be our transparency and it shouldn't render our sky out, right? Because we're only using that for lighting. Also, feel free to add any extra lighting you feel might be necessary, such as point lights. And I know you might have been taught to use the exposure under Arnold, but use intensity instead. It is a more measurable unit. If you ever want to use more realistic lighting units, this will allow us to do so. Right? The only difference is you might need to have bigger numbers, but that's not such a big deal. Obviously that was a little too much. But yeah, you get the idea. Yeah, that was the Maya render pipeline.